Coming to the Ann Arbor District Library. My name is Emily and I'm on the events team here, and we are so happy to, with our friends at Literati, welcome Barbara McQuade back to AADL. All right, so I just want to let you guys know how tonight's program is going to go, since we've got a lot of folks here, really good turnout. So our friends at Literati are back behind you across the aisle. They have books for sale. They have books that are unsigned as well as pre-signed copies if you'd just like to grab one of those. You can buy those anytime during or after the event. After we have our talk, and I'm going to give a little spiel about that in a second, there's going to be a signing line. And Barbara is going to be signing books at this table. The line is going to come in front of the stage, and as you see, we've got some stanchions around here, so I would love it if you could make an orderly little queue around these stanchions. I would really appreciate it. We can give you some help if it's a little confusing. And then, so once you come up and Barbara signs your book, then please exit out that center aisle and out the door so we can just have a nice flow going. Okay. All right. So I want to introduce Lee Graydon, who's going to be talking with us tonight. So among many other things, he was a city council member of Ann Arbor for many years. So nice to have a townie here talking with us. They're going to have a nice chat about Barbara's new book, The Fix, for about 30 minutes. And then my friends here, we're going to be distributing some index cards, as well as some pencils if you don't have anything to write with. And if you have a question, you can write it down on that card, and then you can raise that card up. We'll gather. We'll have time to answer a few of the questions on that card, so your question may get answered, and that will happen at the end prior to the signing. Just a couple more things. If you haven't silenced your device, please do so, just so we can enjoy our presentation uninterrupted this evening. And if you need to find the restrooms, they are right back behind you. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lee. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And I also want to thank the Ann Arbor District Library and Literati Bookstore for sponsoring this event. And a welcome and thank you to a dear friend of mine, Barbara McQuade, as we talk to her about her new book, The Fix, Saving America from the Corruption of a Mob-Style Government. So, hello, Barb.
Hello, Lee. Thank you so much for hosting this. How about a round of applause for our city council member, Lee Graydon. Lee is a wonderful public servant. And I, too, am grateful to Literati and the Ann Arbor District Library for hosting us. You know, some book, when you do a book talk, sometimes they say, well, we usually like to start 5 or 10 minutes late. Not at the Ann Arbor District Library. You see that clock up there? They said the second it hits 6:30, it's go time. I appreciate that, Emily. Thank you for that. And I also want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. It's a beautiful night. You could be doing anything else with your time. And I know people say this, and it always sounds corny when I hear other people say it, but it's truly humbling. And I am honored that you would come out and devote a little bit of time to coming out tonight. Because I have ideas I want to share with you, because I want to, help make our country a better place for democracy. And when I see all of you, it makes me feel like I'm not alone in trying to take back our democracy. So thank you, and let's get to it, Lee.
Let's get started. So, Barb, we are fresh off of the very successful publication of your first book, Attack from Within, How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. Why did you decide to write this book now, and why did you decide to call it The Fix?
Well, the title is sort of a double entendre, as they say among the French. Two meanings. One is The Fix because it proposes solutions, and more than half the book is about solutions, and I'm really proud of that. But the other part of The Fix really suggests, the fix is in, a rigged system. And certainly disinformation is part of that, and I continue that conversation in this book. But what it really reminded me of is the work that I did as a federal prosecutor, prosecuting cases of corrupt public officials, con men, and members of organized crime enterprises. And the thing that ties those cases together that you see so often in organized crime is a person who is in power exerts pain on their target. It is somebody who has something they want, and so they exert pain on that target in an effort to coerce them to come to the table to negotiate their own punishment. And early on in this administration, we saw the dismissal of the Eric Adams case. Remember, he was the mayor of New York who'd been charged with bribery in the past administration. He gets his case dismissed, but they want something in exchange. And they want to dismiss that case, but without prejudice, meaning they can bring it back at any time they want. And what they wanted was his cooperation in immigration enforcement. Even Donald Trump's hand-picked U.S. Attorney there in the Southern District of New York said, I think this is a quid pro quo. That's a term used in bribery cases. How ironic that the bribery case was dismissed based on bribery. And then there was more. We saw the executive orders entered by the president against law firms, making these baseless allegations against them and saying they were going to be banned from federal buildings, including courthouses. Lee, you're a lawyer. You can't really practice law if you're not allowed in the courthouse. Against universities, right, claiming they were engaged in illegal activity and taking away their funding. We saw frivolous lawsuits against the media, many of whom caved and capitulated to these demands. Remember, there was one where CBS was sued for an episode of 60 Minutes where Kamala Harris appeared and was interviewed, and it turned out that part of her interview was edited, and so Donald Trump filed a lawsuit claiming that this was a violation of consumer protection laws because it defrauded the public. Every interview that is done for television is edited, right? The show is called 60 Minutes. It's not 72 minutes, whatever. They have to edit it to put it on television. And so these very frivolous claims were the infliction of pain, but they wanted to get out from under it, and so they paid him off in ways he didn't deserve. And what happens in those situations is that critic is now silenced, and they are controlled and owned by the person who has bought them off. And in that way, I see similarities between the mob crimes that we talk about in the book and what we're seeing in the Trump administration.
I want to point out that, personally, I am a huge fan of the Godfather movies. And when you read the book, you will see the analogies that Barb draws between the tactics of Vito Corleone, the Godfather from the books and the movies, and the tactics of the Trump administration. You describe them as mob-style tactics, and you've just touched on a few of those. I do want to point out, when you get your book, be sure you flip it over and look at the back, because there is a glowing review from Robert De Niro, who won Best Supporting Actor for playing young Vito Corleone in The Godfather 2 in 1974. So make sure you check that out. That's impressive, Barb.
I have friends in high places.
You have a long career, not just 7 years as our federal prosecutor here in Southeast Michigan, but prior to that as a prosecutor in the Department of Justice. What types of experiences did you bring from your decades as a public prosecutor for the federal government that you took with you as you're both researching and writing the fix?
I think just, some insights into how crimes operate certainly in the organized crime realm, white-collar crime realm. So for example, learning the lesson of extortionists. And we saw that play out in public corruption cases. We saw that play out in internet child predator cases, in cases called sextortion, where predators find kids online and make escalating demands for nude photos and then threats in exchange. But the lesson of extortion, I think, is that what happens is people pay off the extortionist, and they think, I will make this payment once, and everything will be okay, they will go away, and I can get back to life as normal. But in fact, just the opposite is true. Once you pay the extortionist, they know you're an easy mark, and they own you, and they keep coming back for more. it's like, giving your lunch money to the bully. They know where they can, find an easy mark. One of the examples from my work as a prosecutor comes from the case in which the U.S. Attorney's Office where I worked, we prosecuted former Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick. He was prosecuted for extortion, bribery, fraud, and tax offenses involving the awarding of city public works contracts. And these are contracts worth, $10 and $20 million. These are enormous contracts. And the job of the public servant is to take bids and to award the contract to the company that can provide the best services at the lowest price for the people that they represent. But what we proved in the Kilpatrick case is that they were instead doing it in exchange for kickbacks. And companies who played by the rules lost their contracts. I talk in the book about a case involving a man named Tom Hardiman. He was the owner of a contracting firm that wanted to get this kind of work, and he kept losing his bids. And he realized ultimately it was because he was told, we would like Bobby Ferguson to do your excavating work. And he would say, I don't need Bobby Ferguson. This was a close friend of the mayor's. And I don't need someone. I already have a subcontractor who does excavating work. And they would say to him, well, that's good, because Bobby Ferguson isn't going to do the excavating anyway, but you're still going to pay him 25%. And so the first couple of times this happened, Tom Hardiman said, no, why would I do that? That's illegal. I'm not doing that. Here's my bid, take it or leave it. And they left it. And it happened again, and it happened again. And as he testified, he kept doing this, 5 and 10, 5 and 10. He's saying 5 and 10. That was the value of the contracts he had lost, $5 and $10 million. And he had a company, he had employees to pay, he had bills to pay, he had a family. So finally, he got smart and he realized, if I want this work, I've got to pay the kickback. And so he did. And he got charged, but he ultimately cooperated and testified about this. But what he said is, and this is where that lesson comes in, I thought once I agreed to pay Bobby Ferguson for this contract, that would be the end of it. But it wasn't, because they knew that by accepting this corrupt deal, he could not ever tell anybody about it, right? To report it to the police would be to confess to his own complicity. And so Bobby Ferguson would call him up and demand more money and more and more. And he said, until eventually it got to the point where he would call me on the phone and I found myself racing over his house to bring him $25,000 in cash. And so that's the lesson. These law firms and the media organizations and the universities who've caved to the president's demands, I think they figured this is all going to be good for us. And it's not, because they keep coming back for more. And ultimately, I think that we have seen those who have stood up to the president are the ones who have been applauded, succeeded. I know when it comes to law firms, my students don't want to work for the ones that caved anymore. Some of them have been absorbed into other firms because their employees have left. So I think one lesson is don't pay the extortionist, stand up to the extortionist, and don't let them isolate you or silence you, because that is the accomplice of the extorter.
This is so interesting that I'm actually jumping forward a question, because the tactics you just described, in particular, universities, large organizations, some elected officials, many of whom are revered, have caved, for lack of a better term, sometimes proactively, even before they were subject to a lawsuit or prosecution. But you talk in the book also about something that, from the Department of Justice, from your work as an attorney, about not blaming the victim. So when we get out of this time that we're in, should we see the universities and the organizations that caved as victims who felt they had no choice? Or should we see them as individuals who should have stood up and said no? Because this is going to be one of the questions that I think is asked about these various organizations.
Yeah, I think this is very complicated and it's very nuanced. It was one of the hardest choices we made in charging decisions about, do you see a man like Tom Hardiman as a victim or as a perpetrator, because it takes two to tango, and so you can't be successful with being an extorter unless somebody's willing to pay that kickback. So I think we need to look at them individually. I don't know that we should look at them all collectively, but I think we should also remember that the real wrongdoer here is the one who demanded the kickback in the first place. It was President Trump. it was the Trump administration. Many of these organizations found themselves in an uncomfortable situation and did what they thought was best to survive. Now, did they make the right choice? I don't know. And I think for a law firm like Paul Weiss, one of the most powerful global law firms in the world, where the average compensation is something like $6 million a year, it seems like maybe they could have withstood a little pain and earned maybe, only $5 million last year. So I don't know that I would paint with a broad brush, but I do think it's important when you think about the hierarchy of wrongfulness, who remains at the top, and that's Donald Trump.
So all books have to be finalized and eventually published. And in Trump 2.0, things move so quickly, there are sometimes things that are happening today that can't be included in the book. So I'd like to ask you about one of those. Donald Trump's proposal to create a $1.8 billion fund, it is sometimes referred to as a slush fund, that would be used to reimburse so-called persecuted individuals from the Biden administration. Obviously, this can't be part of the book because this is also recent and you had to go to publication. As you mentioned when we were talking, you were making last-minute revisions, but so much changes so quickly. If approved, these dollars could be used for, among other things, paying individuals who stormed the Capitol in January 2021, violently assaulted police officers. Your theory of the case, how does something like that apply to the mob-style tactics of the administration?
Yeah, this is what I would put in the category of the John Gotti tactic. That is, I'm going to do it in broad daylight and dare anybody to stop me, right? That was the Teflon Don. He wore the fancy suits and the silk ties, and he went about it and just said, stop me if you can. Ultimately, they did. This is corruption on top of corruption on top of corruption. So think about how this case began. Donald Trump files a lawsuit against his own Treasury Department and Internal Revenue Service. He claims that as the executive, the unitary executive, he is the federal government. So in other words, he's suing himself. He even made jokes about it. I guess I'm negotiating with myself. I think that deal will come out pretty well. There's a reason that's a problem, and that is to have jurisdiction in court, there must be a genuine case or controversy. That means true adversity between the parties. You can't sue yourself. You can't sue someone who's aligned with you. You have to have skin in the game, a real dispute, before courts are going to enter the fray. And in fact, the judge had astutely spotted this issue, and she had asked the parties to file a brief explaining how it is that she had jurisdiction over this matter when it appeared that there was no adversity between the parties. It was 2 days before those briefs were due that Donald Trump voluntarily dismissed his lawsuit. Oh, we're going to work it out of court and reach an out-of-court settlement. He had sought $10 billion because a contractor for the IRS had leaked his tax returns to the media. Now, that's wrong. That person should not have done that. That person was criminally charged by the Biden administration, by the way, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Other people who complained about what happened, including Ken Griffin, the big hedge fund manager in New York, he also sued. You know what he got? An apology. Seems about right. Donald Trump says, I lost $10 billion as a result of this. I don't know about you, but I've seen that since he took office for the second time, his net worth has done nothing but go up. And so it seems highly unlikely that he ever would have been able to prove that he had suffered any damages, let alone $10 billion worth of damages. The other thing that's noteworthy about that case is his own Justice Department, which is now led by Todd Blanche, his former personal attorney, failed to assert the kinds of defenses they routinely assert in every case. For example, this offense has a 2-year statute of limitations. It happened in 2019. Donald Trump filed his lawsuit in 2026. Lee, are you good at math?
7. 7 is more than 2.
There you go. Well done. Did you know that Lee was voted by his high school class at Pioneer High School? Green Hill School. Fancy. At Green Hill School, the most likely to become a game show host.
That is true.
Which is how he earned this gig tonight. This is close. Not quite a game show host. So statute of limitations, totally silent. Like, that's the first thing you look at, right? Is it time barred? silent. They didn't assert that. They also did not assert another common defense routinely asserted in a case like this, sovereign immunity, radio silence, and no effort to trace the harm done, the leak, to this $10 billion claim. So the case gets dismissed because Donald Trump voluntarily dismisses it before these briefs are due, and they announce that day that they've come to a resolution to create a fund valued at $1.776 billion to reflect the year of our founding. How lovely. And that will be used to compensate victims of weaponization during the Trump administration. As you said, the people who stormed the Capitol, or people like Michael Flynn, and all of these people who were Trump's allies. The other problem with that is when the Justice Department settles a case, it is supposed to be traceable to the harm alleged in the complaint. This leaking of tax returns has nothing to do with whether somebody was a victim of prosecutorial misconduct in an unrelated case. So that all was bad enough. And in fact, we've seen some Republicans developing a spine, pushing back, and the Justice Department has said that the deal is off the table. But they won't go so far as to legislate to make sure it's off the table. But that's still not the most corrupt part, right? We've talked about kind of two ways it's corrupt. The lawsuit itself, the 1776 fund. Here's the kicker. And in my most cynical view, I happen to believe that maybe this was the plan all along. Because the day after the settlement gets announced, there's another document filed on the docket kind of quietly and not part of the press release and all the hoopla that says, oh, addendum to the settlement deal. President Trump, his sons, and his business shall be free forever from audits for any prior tax returns that were filed. Think about that for a minute. Again, unrelated to the leak. So the idea that we're negotiating apples and oranges here. But there are some experts who estimate the amount of unpaid taxes by Donald Trump is $100 million. So he essentially just took our taxpayer money to the tune of $100 million as part of this settlement. And that part has not been walked back. That part is still out there. So in the same way John Gotti said, why don't you see if you can stop me? Donald Trump has very brazenly just taken the equivalent of $100 million of our money.
Before we get into some of the policy reform ideas you discuss, I want to ask a personal question, which is a good follow-up to some of the things you just said. Retaliation, retribution, the hallmarks of the mob-style tactics that you talk about in the Trump administration. Do you worry that by publishing this book, you are putting a target on your back for retaliation and retribution from the White House? And if so, how do you balance that concern with the very important information in the book and your decision to publish?
Yeah, you know, my dear father-in-law, who is here, by the way, has said, I really enjoyed your book, but I'm a little worried about you. And I share his concerns. You know, when you choose to serve as a prosecutor, you accept the fact that there is, you know, some risk to the work that you do. But I try not to worry about those things, and I want to say what I want to say anyway. When I was a prosecutor, I had some death threats. Most prosecutors do. But most often, I think that the president has bigger fish to fry. You know, I suppose there's a risk that some of his supporters, I mean, I get my share of hate mail. I get my share of really ugly things on social media. But I also have, you know, the backing of a great university, a great city police department. I was going to say the FBI, but I don't know. They've turned. But, you know, it is certainly something that crosses your mind. And what a statement on our country, right? I mean, I can remember a time when we would learn about things like that happening in other countries. The idea that, you know, candidates for office get assassinated or prosecutors, you know, it was never something we had to worry about in our country. And the fact that you have to even, you know, think about it, I think says a lot about where we are at this moment in our nation's history.
So let's talk about how we fix this, hence the fix. And it's really a two-part question. Policymakers, what can policymakers do? You have some very specific policy reform ideas, and I'm hoping you can give a couple of those examples and share with the audience. And then number two, in the spirit of the 250th anniversary of the founding of our country, what can we, the people, do? to try to fix this going forward?
Yeah, so from a policy perspective, I think that we can look at all three branches of government to shore them up. First, Congress. Congress has really been asleep at the wheel. Our founding fathers envisioned a three-branch government with separate and co-equal branches that would serve as checks on each other. They were just getting off of a revolution, a bloody revolution, fought to free themselves from a monarch. And so the last thing they wanted was a king. And so Congress is supposed to be there to serve as a check. And Congress, which is listed in Article 1, the very first one, we don't get to the president until Article 2, is where the real action is, right? The power to declare war, the power of the purse, the power to collect and levy taxes. And yet, we have seen the president just take these powers. There's no congressional declaration of war in Iran. Trump just went in alone. He has unilaterally halted the payment of funds appropriated by Congress, like university grants and other things. He started his tariff program. It took the Supreme Court to stop it, and even though that is a power of Congress. And what did Congress do during all of this? Yeah, nothing. Nothing, right? These are impeachable offenses. At least have the decency to conduct oversight hearings and put some pressure on them or withhold funding for certain things if you don't like what's happening in the executive. No, just go ahead, do whatever you want. So I think we need to really reconsider the way we elect our members of Congress. One idea that I think would be helpful is ranked choice voting. One of the things that does is helps to, it has a moderating effect and tends to weed out some of the more extreme candidates. For example, Alaska and Maine use it, and in Alaska, they have elected Lisa Murkowski to the Senate, a very moderate Republican. I think we could get some of that back. I think we need to do in other states what we've done here in Michigan, which is to end gerrymandering by developing a citizens-based, voters, not politicians, redistricting commission. Anybody here involved in voters, not politicians? Yeah, nice to see some hands. Thank you for your service. It's fantastic. And now I think the next phase is getting money out of politics, right, which many people are involved in as well. And thank you for that, because I think that's very important. And a third thing I would say is there's an idea of proportional representation. So here in Ann Arbor, we are represented by the great Debbie Dingell. And
Congresswoman Dingell is here, by the way. I saw her sneak in the back while you were speaking.
I'm glad.
Wave again, Debbie, 'cause some people are turning around looking for you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Dingell. You see, I call her great because she always shows up. She shows up to be with her constituents. Thank you very much for being here. But what if we had not just one Debbie Dingell, but 5 of them? Wouldn't that be, that would be a force. She's already a force. She has the force of 5 already. But the idea of proportional representation is that rather than a winner-take-all in a district, you might have multiple members for each seat. And that way you could have, say, if Ann Arbor is 60% Democratic, then 3 of the 5 seats go to Democrats, 2 of the 5 seats go to Republicans, and everybody can have their voice represented. And even more importantly, it could lead to the creation of additional parties, where you've got maybe a far-left party, a far-right party, some moderate parties, and that could be very healthy for our democracy. So those are some things to think about from the legislative branch. For the judicial branch, this might be a cockamamie idea, but you know how J.D. Vance is fond of saying things like, well, they've issued an order, now let them go enforce it, right? This defiance of court orders because courts don't have any ability to enforce their orders. What if we were, here's some proposed legislation for Congresswoman Dingell. What if we were to move the U.S. Marshals Service, part of the Department of Justice, from the executive branch and over to the judicial branch so that they could hold people who disobey court orders in contempt, civil contempt, so it's not a criminal prosecution, meaning we will put you in jail until you comply with this court order. I think that could work. They already provide court security and transfer of prisoners in courthouses. It would give them one more thing. They'd have they already have a lockup. They could just take somebody who has refused to enforce an order and put them there. And then one last suggestion on the executive branch, that is at the Department of Justice. I think there's some things we should do to formalize some of the norms that existed post-Watergate to ensure the independence of the Justice Department. No communications between the White House and DOJ on case-based decisions. No partisan factors may be considered in charging decisions, and a case may be indicted only if the evidence is sufficient to earn a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt at trial, not just let's see if we can get probable cause and name and shame people just to punish them by indicting them and making that the punishment itself. So those are the institutional things. What can we do as citizens? What can each of us do individually? So much. And seeing the people here who are part of Voters Not Politicians means you know how much you can do. I mean, think about what we achieved here in Michigan by creating these citizens-based redistricting commissions. Michigan went for the first time in 40 years, in the first year those maps were used, elected to the state house, to the governor's office, and to the state senate Democrats for the first time in 40 years. It reflected the will of the people instead of the crazy gerrymandered maps that had been created by partisan political operatives. So we the people have so much power, but there's so much we can do, right? We can work on campaigns. You can work on national campaigns, but local campaigns have a lot of impact on our lives. Voting for people who are city clerks, county clerks, Secretary of State, those people control the elections, and more, those spots are being occupied by election deniers. Those are really important races. So working as a volunteer on candidates of people with integrity is really important. You can join things. I know I have a friend here tonight who recently joined the League of Women Voters of Washtenaw County. Fantastic organization. And the goal there is just to provide information to voters, right? To avoid this idea of, election fraud and all of these kinds of things. Of course, it was founded when women got the right to vote because critics said, oh, these women won't know who to vote for. They don't know anything. And so the League of Women Voters said, well, tell you what, we will provide that information through candidate forums and voter guides. So, get out and just help build democracy. Indivisible chapters, those are terrific. We have some around here. These are great organizations, also grassroots organizations that just want to build up democracy. So those are all good things. But at the very least, the one thing all of us has the power to do right now is to just talk to our friends, our neighbors, our loved ones, because studies say that there's nothing more influential than the people around you. And just talking to them, having the hard conversations. Maybe you have to agree to disagree, but planting seeds about how important it is that we have a government that's responsive to the people. That's incredibly important. And so, be a little bit brave. Have those conversations. You may not convince your loved one, or they may not admit they've been convinced, but if you can just plant a seed to cause them to reconsider their position, you will have done your job.
That deserves applause for sure. One more question, and then we are going to start with some outstanding questions from the audience, and it touches on a little bit of what you were just saying. Thank you. The 2026 midterm elections, the general election, is 5 months away, November 2026. The White House has already hinted at or sometimes explicitly talked about things like using the National Guard to be outside polling places, particularly in communities where there are more voters of color. Should we have mail-in voting? Should it be banned? Ironic, considering Donald Trump uses mail-in voting. He votes from the Washington, D.C. and sends it in the Postal Service to Florida. There's even been concerns about could he cancel the election. Your thoughts as an attorney, someone who worked for the Department of Justice for decades, about the 2026 election, concerns that you have, and again, maybe back to the We the People suggestions you have for folks.
Yeah, mostly I'm confident about the elections. I think that one of the ingenious setups in the Constitution is that we don't have one election, we have many elections across the country. They're run by state law and actually even down to the county level and sometimes even the city level. And as a result, it's very difficult for one troublemaker in Washington to destroy the whole thing. That, I think, is one of the values of the system. Now, Lawfully, I don't think the president can do much because the Constitution says it is up to the states to determine the time, place, and manner of holding elections. Congress has the ability to overlay that with certain laws like the motor voter laws and some other things that have made it easier to cast ballots and to register to vote. But could the president do something lawless by, say, sending in the National Guard or declaring a national emergency? I think possibly he could. Now, in the long run, there would be lawsuits, and I don't think he would prevail, but could he do enough to really disrupt things? I think he could. I think what's more likely is an influence campaign designed to stoke distrust in the system. You know, this past week, California had its primary, and President Trump's been all over Truth Social saying, the election was fixed, it was rigged, it was fraudulent. There's just no evidence of it whatsoever. There are processes for challenging election results, for conducting audits, for conducting recounts. None of that has shown that there's any fraud, but he's stoking those thoughts already. And I think that is some of what this effort is about, so that if he doesn't like the outcome, he can claim to his supporters, well, it was all rigged. I think that's what's most likely. What can we do about that? I think we can pre-bunk some of those kinds of things by helping our friends and neighbors understand that elections do have processes for challenging them. Donald Trump lost all of those challenges in 2020, by the way, but still maintains that there was fraud in the election. Here in Michigan, I feel very confident and very grateful that we have Jocelyn Benson as our Secretary of State. She's terrific. I have said to her in person, I feel very fortunate that at the very moment when our democracy was on the line, we had as our Secretary of State an expert in election law. That was a very fortunate confluence of events. So I feel pretty good about Michigan and where we stand, and cautiously optimistic, but I think we can all play a role in pre-bunking some of these claims.
I'm going to try to put a positive note on this with this great question here from someone in the audience. As a young person during this time, the constant news coverage about corruption is scary, and I feel sometimes it's impossible to cope with. Does anything give you hope?
Yes, thank you for that question, young person. Although in this room, you probably qualify if you're about 55. Thank you, young 55-year-old. We will give you some hope. I understand what that feels like because every day you see the headlines. If you spend too much time on social media, it can really bring you down because there is so much corruption in plain sight and and just meanness and nastiness. You know, one of the themes I talk about in the book is corruption, cruelty, and chaos, because those, in my view, are the hallmarks of the Trump administration. And so it's easy to feel helpless and hopeless. But keep in mind, that is one of the goals of someone who is a crime boss or an authoritarian. It is to make you feel hopeless and helpless. You don't have a chance. One of the reasons you go after these centers of power is if you can get them to bend to their knees, everybody else says, wow, I better keep my mouth shut because if they can do it to them, they can do it to me. But what gives me hope, frankly, is young people, you 54 and under people. I have the privilege of teaching at Michigan Law School where I see so many bright young people who want to be part of the solution. They're really engaged. They're really involved. They work the polls. Our law school gives students off on election day, which I think is wonderful. And they get out there and work. You know, they were at the, I guess we call it Huntington Place now. I was going to say Cobo Center. Huntington Place when the Stop the Steal demagogues were pounding on the windows and they kept counting, you know. So young people give me a lot of hope. But it isn't just young people. I'll tell you who else gives me hope. Like people like the people in this room, because you care about democracy. In accordance with the publication of this book, I've been able to get out and talk to people in other parts of the country. And it's so great to meet people who care, right? They show up. They want to know what they can do. There may be some forces in our country that are pushing us against democracy, but I still think there are more of us than there are of them. And so if we can just encourage good people to get out and vote and to take charge and to get involved, I am hopeful that we can seize this moment to take back our democracy.
She has not seen these questions, obviously, because they're being handed to us. That is a perfect segue, though, to another excellent question. Many of the people in this room likely share your concerns. How do we help communicate to people who don't necessarily agree with the idea that Donald Trump is a problem, or that we face a problem with democracy, et cetera? How do we communicate with those folks?
You mean the crazy people? No, I didn't say that out loud. I didn't say that. No, we all have, people in our orbit who are like that. I think that there are some people who are, Trumpers till the end, and maybe there's no convincing them. I'm more worried about are the people who are just sort of apathetic. Like, I got a decent job, I've got a family, I do my thing. And politics, schmolitics, right? I don't really care much about it. Boy, those are the people who I think are persuadable if you can just get them to care. There are a lot of people. I used to discover this when I would do jury selection, and we'd ask, has anybody read about Kwame Kilpatrick, the mayor of Detroit? There would be people who didn't know who that was. Like, how do you live in this? And they would, they live in Metro Detroit. How do you live in this community? And I know some people pay more attention to the news than others. Like, we're news junkies, but come on. And there are people like that. And so I think that there are many people, perhaps that we know, who are just not paying attention. And I think those are the ones who are persuadable. And maybe those are the people where we ought to devote our energy and just say, hey, who are you thinking about voting for? What do you think is the most important issue going on? And they might say, I don't know. And that gives you your opening to say, well, I'm really concerned about. And, maybe pick one issue to educate yourself about or one topic and, share your views. And so often, that's all it takes. As lawyers, people call us all the time and say, hey, I don't know who to vote for judge. Who should I vote for? And, I try to give them some pros and cons. Well, this one's this one's that. And okay, but who are you voting for? I'm voting for Judge X. Okay, thanks, that's all I needed. You can be very influential if people feel like you know more than they do about something and they trust you. And so have those conversations with people who may be persuadable.
Again, she hasn't seen these questions, and yet she moves into another great question so perfectly, Barb. Could an increase in funding for civics education and media literacy perhaps be part of the fix?
Are these questions I wrote myself?
I'm thinking, this is too perfect.
Yeah. Is there one in there that says, Barb, how do you do your hair like that? That's probably the next one. Oh, yes, my goodness, yes. I think we need that so desperately. One of the things we've seen in society in a shift in education, which is understandable, is an increased emphasis on STEM education. And it's important, right? Science, technology, engineering, math, all of that is really important, but not to the exclusion of everything else. There was a study by NPR that said something like, for every $50 we now spend in public schools on STEM education, we spend something like 50 cents on civics. And although, maybe there's not an equivalence there in terms of priorities or even in terms of equipment that you need for STEM education, but I think we can't lose the importance of civics education, and I would add media literacy, which would, something that, students, when I was coming up through school, maybe didn't need the way our students do today. But in other countries, including Finland, where they are neighbors to Russia and have been bombarded with disinformation for decades, they have begun teaching media literacy in their schools with great success. They help students understand when you read something, don't assume it's accurate, don't assume it's wrong, but dig a little deeper, right? What is the source? What is the evidence for what they are saying? Can you find a second source that is reporting the same information? There are some, basic techniques that we can learn, and I think we should be teaching our children these things. The same thing with civics education. Do you ever watch those, Jay Leno interview of Man on the Street? What are the 3 branches of government? And they say, Huey, Dewey, and Louie or something? But it is so important because when someone like J.D. Vance posts online, as he has, and says these rogue courts are lunatic leftists trying to tell the president what he can and cannot do with his executive power, And you say, well, yeah, that's what the judiciary does, right? They check executive power. But if you don't know anything about civics, that sounds pretty bad, right? And so that's why it's so important that our electorate be informed so that we can make good choices.
What do we think? One more question from here? One more question. Okay. One more question, and then we will move to the portion where you get to say hello to Barb and get a book signed. This is a trickier one, Barb, so I hope you're ready for this. Do you consider Michigan Medicine's decision to discontinue gender-affirming care to be perhaps an example of an organization caving to the concerns of the Trump administration?
Yeah, you know, I will say that this is like one of those things earlier we talked about with regard to nuance. It's very important to think about the issue and the motivation behind the decision. I don't like the decision, but I wasn't, there to understand all of the aspects of it. It reminds me, though, of these extortion cases where I'm going to bend on this one thing and then everything's going to be okay. They're likely to come back for more. Now, maybe you thought that was the right thing to do anyway, Michigan Medicine, but to the extent it was simply to pander to who's in the White House for fear of taking away more grants, I think I don't blame you I don't blame you because you are a victim, but I do think it may be a poor choice, and people who are depending on you have now been further victimized by your choice.
I apologize that we are not able to get to more questions because there are so many good ones in here, but we want to make sure there is enough time for folks, again, to meet Barb, have their book signed. So thank you again to Barb McQuade, author of The Fix.
Thank you all very much for your attention and your good questions. And Lee, I just want to say, I think your future in game show hosting is still in good stead.
Come on down for Barb McQuade and have your book signed.
Okay, everybody. So as we get